your flight. NBA YoungBoy actually reached out to the Prince family and asked the Prince family, hey, what will it take to help that man get out of the contract? I respect it. I respect that, Like, I just can't keep on saying ain't nobody supporting me, Because you did. You did. You actually reached out and tried to make that happen. So I got to take my hat off today and I got to give you a flag.
A single phone call reportedly changed the entire conversation. Not a diss track. Not a viral post. Not an interview clip. A phone call. And the moment Finesse2Tymes suggested that people connected to Jay Prince's camp received a call from NBA YoungBoy, fans immediately started asking the same question: what was important enough to happen behind closed doors? Because in hip-hop, public beef is one thing. Private communication is something else entirely. Listen, most situations play out on social media first. Everybody sees the posts, the reactions, the responses. But when conversations move off the internet and into direct contact, people start paying attention. That's when fans begin wondering if there's a bigger story that nobody fully understands yet. According to the claims being discussed, this wasn't about random internet drama. It involved names that carry real influence in rap. Names that have been connected to major artists, major decisions, and major moments for years. That's why the story spread so quickly. But here's where it gets interesting. Nobody outside the people involved knows exactly what was said. There are theories everywhere. Some believe it was an effort to calm tensions before they grew into something bigger. Others think it was about respect, relationships, or unfinished business behind the scenes. Right now, those are only theories. Nothing has been independently confirmed. Still, the reaction says everything. The moment fans heard that NBA YoungBoy's name and Jay Prince's circle were being mentioned in the same conversation, timelines exploded with speculation. People started revisiting old interviews, old comments, and old relationships, trying to figure out what could have led to this moment. And the deeper people looked, the more questions appeared. Because if a private call really happened, what was important enough to bring these names together? That's where this story starts getting complicated. And the answers might be a lot bigger than anyone expected. The reason this story picked up momentum so fast is because it wasn't coming from a random source. The comments that got people talking came from someone who already has connections inside the rap world. That's why fans didn't immediately dismiss it. Instead, they started listening closely. They started asking questions. And before long, the conversation had moved far beyond a single statement. At the center of everything is NBA YoungBoy. For years, YoungBoy has built one of the most dedicated fan bases in hip-hop. His supporters follow everything: the music, the interviews, the social media activity. Even when he stays quiet, people still find ways to analyze what might be happening around him. That's the level of attention he attracts. Every move becomes a topic of discussion whether he wants it to or not. Then, there is the other side of the story. When people hear the name Jay Prince, they immediately think about influence. They think about relationships that stretch across decades. They think about someone whose presence in a situation often means there is more happening behind the scenes than what the public can see. That's why the mention of a reported call immediately changed the tone of the conversation. Suddenly, people weren't treating it like internet drama anymore. Listen. Nobody was talking about a public argument. Nobody was talking about a viral exchange happening in real time. The focus was on a private conversation. And that's exactly what made the situation feel different. Because private conversations usually happen for a reason. They happen when somebody believes something important needs to be discussed directly. According to the claims being circulated, a call was reportedly made involving people connected to Jay Prince's team. Beyond that, the details remain unclear. That's an important point. A lot of theories started appearing almost immediately, but verified information remained limited. The internet filled in the blanks long before anyone could confirm exactly what happened. And that's where the confusion started. Some people believed the call was connected to existing tensions that fans had already been discussing online. Others felt it could have been related to business relationships, mutual connections, or conversations that never reached the public. At that stage, nobody really knew. What people had was a claim, a few reactions, and a lot of speculation. But the timing caught everyone's attention. The rap world has been through enough situations over the years for fans to recognize when something feels unusual. When respected industry figures and major artists end up being mentioned together in a story involving private communication, people naturally become curious. They want to know what happened before the story became public. They want to know who reached out first. They want to know what caused the conversation in the first place. Check this out. One of the biggest reasons the story kept spreading was because there wasn't an obvious explanation. If there had been clear details from the beginning, the discussion probably would have ended quickly. Instead, every answer seemed to create another question. That's how rumors grow. That's how narratives start taking shape online before all the facts are available. Meanwhile, fans began revisiting old situations involving the people connected to the story. They looked back at previous interviews. They revisited comments from months earlier. They searched for clues that might explain why this alleged call mattered. Some of those connections made sense. Others were stretches. But that didn't stop people from trying to build a timeline. The deeper people looked, the more they realized something important. The real story wasn't necessarily the call itself. The real story was what the call might represent. Because when communication moves behind closed doors, it usually suggests that the people involved believe the situation deserves a different approach. Public statements are for everybody. Private conversations are for specific people. That's a distinction fans immediately noticed. At the same time, there was another layer developing in the background. People close to hip-hop culture understand that relationships matter. Connections matter. Respect matters. Sometimes situations that look simple from the outside become much more complicated once those relationships enter the picture. That's why so many observers were careful about jumping to conclusions. There simply wasn't enough confirmed information to fully understand what was happening. Still, the discussion wasn't slowing down. Every hour seemed to bring new opinions, new interpretations, new theories about what the reported communication could mean. Some believed it signaled a possible effort to clear the air. Others thought it pointed toward unresolved issues that hadn't become public yet. At that stage, both sides were guessing. And that's what made the situation so interesting. Nobody had a complete picture. People knew the names involved. People knew a reported call had become part of the conversation. But the reason behind it remained a mystery. And as more people started paying attention, that mystery only became bigger. The story was no longer about one statement. It was becoming a debate about what might have happened before anybody else knew there was a story at all. As the conversation kept growing, the focus started shifting away from the reported call itself. Now people were paying attention to the reaction. And in many ways, the reaction became the story. Social media moved exactly how it always moves when a major name gets attached to an unclear situation. Within hours, clips were everywhere. Posts were being shared across multiple platforms. People were pulling apart every word that had been said, looking for hidden meanings. Some listeners thought the message was obvious. Others heard something completely different. That was the first sign that things were becoming complicated. Nobody seemed to agree on what the reported call actually represented. According to the discussions happening online, one group believed the communication was a sign that somebody wanted to address a situation directly before it grew larger. Another group argued that there wasn't enough information to make that assumption. Both sides were working with the same limited facts, yet they were reaching completely different conclusions. And that's when the theories started multiplying. Check this out. People began creating timelines based on previous events involving the names connected to the story. Old interviews suddenly became relevant again. Comments that had been forgotten months earlier started resurfacing. Fans were digging through clips, searching for anything that might explain why this alleged communication mattered now. Some of those connections seemed reasonable. Others felt like a reach. But once social media starts building a narrative, facts and assumptions often begin mixing together. That's why it became harder to separate what was known from what was simply being guessed. Meanwhile, another question started gaining attention. Why was this information becoming public in the first place? Think about it. If a conversation happened privately, why were people hearing about it now? That question led to an entirely new set of theories. Some observers believed the details were shared intentionally. Others thought the information simply found its way into public discussion through normal industry conversations. At that stage, nobody outside the people involved could say for certain. The uncertainty only added fuel to the story. Because every time somebody tried to explain the situation, another person would point out a contradiction. One theory suggested the call was connected to respect and communication between individuals with mutual connections. Another theory suggested it could have been related to issues that fans didn't fully understand yet. A third group argued that people were turning a simple conversation into something much larger than it really was. And honestly, all three possibilities were being discussed at the same time. That's what made the situation so difficult to read. Listen, when information is incomplete, confidence can be misleading. The loudest voices online often sound the most certain. But certainty doesn't automatically mean accuracy. The truth is that many people discussing this situation were making conclusions before the complete picture had emerged. Still, the public fascination continued growing. The reason wasn't hard to understand. NBA YoungBoy is one of the most watched artists in hip-hop. Every development connected to him generates attention. Every rumor creates debate. His supporters and critics both pay attention for different reasons. So the moment his name became attached to a story involving a reported private call, the internet was guaranteed to react. Then another layer appeared. Some fans started focusing less on YoungBoy and more on the involvement of people connected to J. Prince. That changed the conversation again. Because now the discussion wasn't only about an artist. It was about influence, relationships, connections that reach far beyond a single moment. Whether people agreed or disagreed with the theories being presented, most recognized that those names carry significance within hip-hop culture. And suddenly, the story felt bigger than it had at the beginning. What started as a discussion about a reported phone call was turning into a broader debate about communication, respect, and what really happens behind closed doors in the music industry. But now it gets strange. The more people talked about the situation, the less clarity seemed to exist. Instead of answers, new questions kept appearing. If the communication was positive, why was everyone treating it like a mystery? If the communication was serious, why were details still so limited? And if the communication wasn't important at all, why had so many people become invested in understanding it? Those questions lingered over every discussion. Nobody seemed able to answer them definitively. At the same time, certain observers started pointing out something important. For all the speculation, very few people involved had publicly provided detailed explanations. That silence created an opening. And whenever there is silence, theories usually rush in to fill the space. Some people interpreted the lack of public clarification as meaningful. Others saw it as completely normal. After all, not every private conversation is meant for public consumption. Not every situation requires a public response. But because fans were already invested, every absence of information started feeling like information. That's when the first major twist emerged. The story was no longer about what happened. The story had become about what people believed happened. And those are two very different things. If you're following this situation closely, make sure you're subscribed, because from here the questions get bigger, the theories get stronger, and the line between public perception and reality becomes even harder to see. By this point, one thing was clear. The reported call had triggered a conversation far larger than anyone expected. And the deeper people looked, the more they realized they might only be seeing a small piece of a much bigger picture. What made the situation even more interesting was what happened after the initial wave of reactions. Instead of fading away like most internet stories, this one kept growing. New discussions appeared every day. New interpretations surfaced. And people who normally stayed out of these conversations suddenly started paying attention. The reason was simple. There were still too many unanswered questions. The reported call had already become a topic across social media, but now the focus was shifting toward motive. People weren't asking whether a conversation happened anymore. They were asking why it happened. And depending on who you listened to, the answer changed completely. Some observers believe the communication could have been about preventing a misunderstanding from becoming something larger. In the music business, not every issue is handled publicly. Sometimes people speak directly before situations spiral out of control. To be clear, there is no confirmed evidence proving that was the purpose of the reported call. But it became one of the most common theories being discussed. Others had a completely different view. They argued that fans were assuming too much. Their position was straightforward. Just because influential names are involved doesn't automatically mean there is conflict. Sometimes conversations are exactly what they appear to be. Conversations. Nothing more. Nothing less. But here's the thing. That explanation didn't satisfy everyone. The reason is because people kept returning to the same point. If the situation was simple, why had it attracted so much attention in the first place? That question kept pulling the discussion back into deeper territory. Soon, people started examining the relationships surrounding everyone involved. Not just current relationships. Old relationships too. Industry ties. Mutual acquaintances. Previous interactions. Fans began creating entire narratives based on connections that may or may not have had anything to do with the reported call. And that's where caution becomes important. Because there is a major difference between observing a connection and proving a connection. A lot of the speculation being shared online relied on assumptions rather than verified facts. That's not unusual during stories like this. In fact, it happens almost every time information is limited. The less people know, the more they tend to guess. Still, some of the theories gained traction because they sounded plausible. One theory suggested the reported communication reflected the importance of respect within hip-hop culture. Not necessarily disagreement. Not necessarily conflict. Just respect? The idea was that certain situations require direct communication when influential figures become aware of them. Again, that's only a theory. Nothing publicly available confirms that interpretation. But it shows where people's minds were going. Listen. What often gets overlooked in stories like this is how much of the rap industry operates away from cameras. Fans see interviews. They see social media posts. They see performances. But they don't see every phone call. They don't see every private meeting. They don't hear every conversation taking place between artists, managers, business partners, and longtime associates. Because of that reality, many observers felt there could be context missing from the public version of events. Not hidden facts. Not secret evidence. Just context. And sometimes context changes everything. As the discussion continued, another possibility started appearing. Some people wondered if the public reaction itself had become larger than the original situation. Think about that for a second. What if the attention wasn't being driven by the reported call? What if it was being driven by the names attached to it? That's an important distinction. Because when highly recognizable figures become connected to the same story, public interest naturally increases. Sometimes the conversation surrounding an event becomes much larger than the event itself. That possibility caused some observers to step back and reassess what they actually knew. The answer wasn't much. A reported call, a few public comments, a lot of theories, and very little direct confirmation. Yet despite that, people were treating the story like a puzzle that needed solving. But now another layer was emerging. The longer nobody offered a detailed explanation, the more speculation continued growing. Some fans interpreted the silence as meaningful. Others argued that silence meant absolutely nothing. Both positions gained support. Both positions gained criticism. The result was a conversation moving in multiple directions at once. Check this out. Whenever uncertainty lasts long enough, people begin treating possibilities like probabilities. Then probabilities start sounding like facts. That's usually where confusion reaches its highest level. And that's exactly why separating confirmed information from speculation became more important than ever. At this stage, one fact remained unchanged. Nobody outside the individuals directly involved knew the complete story. Everything else existed somewhere on a spectrum between observation and assumption. Still, that reality didn't reduce the intrigue. If anything, it increased it, because people sensed there was more beneath the surface. Not necessarily drama, not necessarily conflict, just more. More context, more explanation, more details that hadn't reached the public. And until those details emerged, the discussion would continue. The reported call had already transformed from a simple claim into one of those stories, where every new piece of information felt significant. Every reaction mattered. Every comment generated analysis. Yet despite all the attention, the central mystery remained untouched. Why did the communication happen? That question was still sitting at the center of everything. And before long, developments would push the story into an entirely different direction, bringing the conversation closer to answers while creating a brand new set of questions nobody saw coming. The turning point came when people started realizing they may have been focusing on the wrong question the entire time. For days, the conversation had centered around whether the reported call happened and what might have been said. But now attention was shifting somewhere else. Instead of asking about the content of the communication, people started asking about the impact. Because regardless of what was discussed, the story had already accomplished something important. It got everybody's attention. And once that happened, the situation became bigger than a single conversation. Listen, a lot of stories in hip-hop disappear within 24 hours. A clip goes viral. People react. Then the internet moves on. This wasn't one of those stories. The reason it lasted was because nobody could fully explain it. Every answer seemed incomplete. Every explanation left something unresolved. That uncertainty kept the discussion alive. As more people weighed in, a clearer picture started forming. Not a complete picture, but a clearer one. The growing consensus among many observers was that the reported communication showed how different real-world conversations can be from internet narratives. Online, people often assume every disagreement must become public. Every issue must become content. Every misunderstanding must turn into a spectacle. Real life doesn't always work like that. Sometimes communication happens privately. Sometimes people speak directly. Sometimes situations are addressed long before the public ever hears about them. That realization changed how many people viewed the story. Suddenly, the reported call wasn't being interpreted solely as a dramatic moment. Some began seeing it as evidence that important conversations still happen away from social media. But now another twist appeared. The more reasonable interpretations gained traction, the less dramatic the story became. And strangely enough, that created a new problem. Because the internet usually prefers drama over moderation. It prefers conflict over uncertainty. It prefers definitive conclusions over incomplete information. Yet this story refused to provide a definitive conclusion. Every path eventually led back to the same reality. There simply wasn't enough verified information to know exactly what motivated the communication. Check this out. That lack of certainty ended up becoming the most important detail of all. Why? Because it forced people to confront the difference between what they knew and what they assumed. For weeks, theories had dominated the discussion. Some theories suggested tension. Some suggested reconciliation. Some suggested business. Others suggested respect. But none of those explanations had been fully confirmed. The story existed inside a space where possibilities were competing against each other. And that meant the mystery remained intact. Meanwhile, another observation started gaining attention. The individuals at the center of the discussion were continuing to move forward with their lives and careers, while the internet remained focused on decoding every detail. Think about that. Sometimes fans become more invested in solving a story than the people actually connected to it. That's not criticism. It's just reality. People naturally want answers, especially when a story involves recognizable names and unanswered questions. The result was a fascinating contrast. On one side, public discussion continued generating theories. On the other side, concrete information remained limited. That gap never fully closed. And because it never closed, the conversation never truly settled. Listen, one of the biggest lessons from situations like this is that public perception can become its own force. Once enough people start discussing a narrative, the narrative develops momentum. At that point, every new comment becomes evidence to some people. Every silence becomes evidence to others. And suddenly, ordinary details begin carrying extraordinary significance. That's exactly what happened here. The reported call became more than a reported call. It became a symbol. A symbol of the unseen side of the music industry. The side built on relationships, communication, connections, conversations that happen long before cameras start recording. But even with that understanding, important questions remain. What specifically triggered the communication? Who initiated it? What outcome, if any, came from it? Those questions continue hovering over the entire story. And until more information becomes available, they will likely remain unanswered. That brings us to where things stand now. The mystery hasn't completely disappeared. The speculation hasn't completely stopped. And the public still doesn't possess every piece of the puzzle. What we do know is relatively simple. A reported call became public discussion. The discussion sparked widespread reaction. The reaction generated theories. The theories created a larger narrative. And that narrative eventually became one of the most talked about aspects of the situation. But the final chapter has not been written. Not yet. Because stories involving influential people, private communication, and unanswered questions rarely end with a clean explanation. Sometimes new information appears months later. Sometimes it never appears at all. And that's why this conversation continues. Not because people have all the answers, but because they don't. The biggest question isn't whether the reported call happened. The biggest question is whether the public ever gets enough information to understand why it mattered in the first place. Until then, the debate remains open. The theories remain active. And the mystery that started with one reported phone call continues to leave people wondering what really happened behind the scenes. If you've made it this far, then you already know this story is bigger than a simple headline. What started with a reported phone call turned into a conversation about influence, communication, and how much of the rap industry actually operates behind closed doors. The public heard pieces of the story, but the full picture is still missing. And that's exactly why people continue debating it. As always, separate confirmed facts from speculation. There are still questions that haven't been answered, and until more information comes out, a lot of the theories floating around online remain exactly that, theories. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update. We follow these stories carefully, focus on the details, and avoid jumping to conclusions before the facts are there. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think a private call between influential people is usually a sign that a situation is being resolved behind the scenes? Or do you think these kinds of conversations often reveal that there's a much bigger issue the public doesn't know about yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes the most important part of a story isn't what gets said publicly. It's what happens when the cameras are off, the phones start ringing, and only a few people know what was really discussed.